Welcome to Run the Adventure, a podcast about getting the most out of published modules for your tabletop role-playing game. I'm your host, Sid Razavi. For this episode, I'm joined by Justin Alexander from the Alexandrian and Atlas Games to discuss the classic Dungeons & Dragons Dragonlance adventure, Dragons of Despair. I discovered the Dragonlance novels about the same time I discovered D&D. Like many a nerdy schoolboy, I saw a lot of myself in Raistlin and may have had a wee crush on Kitiara. When a few years later I had moved from the basic expert companion set of D&D to advanced Dungeons & Dragons, I picked up the original line of Dragonlance modules and ran the first few for my friends. It always felt like a task unfinished as we failed to complete the epic campaign. Over time, rose-tinted glasses made me think of running it again. So during the pandemic lockdown of 2020, when I made my first tentative foray into online play, I ran the first couple of modules using 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, modifying the version compiled by Weiss and Hickman for D&D 3.5 edition. It was a lot of fun, but also a lot of work remixing this old school series of adventures for modern sensibilities. Only one of my players was familiar with the novels, and so was automatically buying into the quirks of the setting. Yet I'm glad I scratched that itch. I got a lot of fun out of it and I made a few new online friends. Now, with Dragonlance finally returning to welcome a new set of fans and D&D players, it feels like a good time to return to Kryn as it was first told in the modules, novels, and later graphic novels and cartoons. Before we get to the meat of the episode, I'd like to bring to your attention that listeners to the pod will get a 5% discount when ordering from Dungeonland when they use the promo code RUNTHEADVENTURE, all one word. See link to the store in the show notes. Furthermore, if you support the pod through our Patreon, you will be able to get a nice 10% discount on all your purchases from Dungeonland. Now let's get back to the show. The following content is aimed at Gamesmasters or players who want to be Gamesmasters. So if this is a module you're going to play, this is the point when it's customary to warn you about a hell of a lot of spoilers.
Summary of the adventure.
The player characters are several long-term friends who parted 5 years ago before the start of the adventure to find evidence of the true gods who disappeared from Kryn at the time of the cataclysm several hundred years ago. Returning to the village of Solace at the appointed time, they find signs of subtle change amongst the familiar treetop community. The Seekers have spread their false religion across the region out of their town of Haven. They work in concert with hobgoblin mercenaries who accost the heroes on their return. The hobgoblins and the Seekers are looking for the blue crystal staff currently in the possession of one of the player characters. There are also signs of war in distant lands with goblin deserters left to banditry in the hills. The homecoming is cut short when the bearer of the blue crystal staff is discovered and the players must make a quick getaway with the help of an old friend, the lovely Tika Whalen. Fleeing Solace, they may go anywhere to seek help. Perhaps they will head to Haven, the heart of Seeker territory, looking to turn the staff over to them, or find an ally within the council there. Or they may seek help from the plains folk, or indeed turn south towards the elven lands of Qualinesti. Whichever way they go, however, they will be pointed towards Zaxxoroth, where the blue crystal staff came from. Whether it is a dream or a unicorn, all the divine signs point to Zaxxoroth. Along the way, the heroes must save a plainsman fleeing a new breed of monster, the Draconian, winged, evil serpent-like creatures whose origins are to remain a mystery for now. More of these creatures are found scattered across the plains, leaving a wake of destruction with abandoned and destroyed villages. To the east, past the Forsaken Pass, and along the Dire Wood, the heroes eventually get to the swamps of Zaxxoroth. Once the site of the greatest port of the age before the cataclysm, the city now lies mostly underground with only a few buildings left on the surface. But Before they get to explore its depths, something unexpected happens. A dragon, a creature thought to be nothing more than a child's tale, rises out of a well and attacks them with its acidic breath. This will almost certainly prove fatal to one of the heroes, and it is an opportune time to unlock the healing power of the blue crystal staff. For like dragons, divine healing has been absent from Krynn since the old gods disappeared. In a dramatic, if a little too verbose sequence, a dead player character will be brought back to life at the feet of the statue of Mishakal, goddess of healing, where the blue crystal staff originates. At this point, the heroes are tasked by the goddess to retrieve the discs of Mishakal that will bring back knowledge of the true gods to Krynn. The only slight challenge is that the discs are part of the horde of the dragon Onyx, who moments ago killed one of the heroes. Still, the key to the final confrontation lies in the blue crystal staff and the faith of the character who assumes the role of prophet. Exploring the 3 levels of Zaxxoroth, the heroes find a ruined city still preserved underground, with running streams and architecture hinting at its former glory and hubris. Of course, now its inhabitants are the filthy but mostly harmless gully dwarves and the vile draconians who serve the Dragon Master. There is much to explore, and it is quite likely no party will explore it all given the many paths through the place. There are many neat things to find and to interact with throughout, with rich rewards for the brave. Whether through stealth, or by getting dubious help from the gully dwarves, or taking a more direct approach, the heroes will come to a final confrontation with the Dragon Onyx, a battle that they will find themselves completely outmatched for, at least were it not for the divine intervention made possible through the blue crystal staff. Once they have defeated the dragon, they will have a short time to grab what they can, especially those precious discs, before the whole place collapses and disappears into history for good. The adventure ends with the blue crystal staff returning to its restful place in the hands of Mishakal's statue, and the first true cleric in hundreds of years going out to bring news of the return of the true gods to Krynn.
Are you looking for a D&D podcast with a dark side? Something more like Game of Thrones and less like Monty Python? Tale of the Manticore is part dark fantasy audio drama, part solo D&D RPG. There's no plot armor here. The dice make all the important decisions. Join me as I resurrect the excitement, wonder, and emotion of old-school D&D. Made for a mature audience, Tale of the Manticore is both a fiction and a game. It's the story where chaos rolls.
Interview with the Gamesmaster.
Welcome. For this episode, I'm joined by Justin Alexander of Atlas Games and the Alexandrian website and YouTube channel to talk about Dragons of Despair, DL1, the first of the Dragonlance Chronicles modules that was published in the 80s. Welcome, Justin.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Let's dive straight into kind of talking about this module and what makes it an interesting one. Where were some of the fun things you've seen in the module itself?
Oh, well, it's a fascinating module to look back on. I mean, if you go back to 1984 when it was coming out, something that can kind of get a little bit lost looking at it today is just how sort of radically experimental the entire Dragonlance saga was. If you go back and look at that, they were really beginning to try and figure out how are we going to bring epic fantasy into Dungeons and Dragons. You have before this you have the individual mysteries and dungeons and so forth, lots of different types of adventures. But what Tracy Hickman and Douglas Niles and Howard Johnson and the rest of the Dragonlance design team at TSR were really looking to accomplish here was they were looking not only at like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which is the obvious example, but also things like Terry Brooks' Shannara series or David Eddings' Belgariad, those kinds of big fantasy epics that were coming out of Del Rey Del Rey's fantasy line at the time, and they wanted to figure out how to bring that into D&D. And so, looking at this very first module in the saga, like the couple of things that really stand out right away to me looking at it is actually the pre-generated characters, which sometimes get a bad rap because around the same time that they were doing these modules, a decision was made to do a novelization of them and do the Dragonlance Chronicles trilogy by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. And so there's a perception these days that like these pre-generated characters who are also the characters from the book, that the idea was that you'd play the character from the book. But the modules were being developed before the books were being written. And so it's actually the other way around, that the books were using the characters from the modules. And the reason that they had these pre-generated characters with these fully fleshed out backgrounds, and that was the big innovation. Previously there had been pre-generated PCs for people to pick up and play in modules, but they had just been collections of stat blocks. And the big sort of like cool innovation here in Dragonlance was that these were fully developed characters with backgrounds. And the reason for that was because they were trying to capture this sort of epic fantasy. And that if you look at something like Lord of the Rings, for example, and you look at main characters in the Fellowship like Aragorn and Boromir, and how those characters have specific backgrounds that tie into the legacy of the ring and the kingdom of Gondor, and the previous war with Sauron and all of that. And what you're looking at is, well, how can we do that in a D&D campaign? And their answer was, well, we need to have these pre-generated characters whose backgrounds tie into this. And so you can have Tanis connected to Kitty-Yara. You can have Sturm connected to the Solamnic Orders of Knights. All these things that are going to be part of the Dragonlance saga, we can have these deep, meaningful connections to it. And so that's an interesting, really kind of cool thing that are diving into. Now, in terms of looking at it through sort of my modern eyes and wanting to look at like what's really cool about running this particular adventure, the coolest thing in this adventure has to be the incredibly cool dungeon of Zak Saroth at the end of the adventure, the Black Dragon's Lair.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting you mentioned the pre-gens because obviously they are incredibly important from a Dragonlance fan's point of view because they're so well established in the legendarium of the novels and the products. But they incorporate these elements of what I think are kind of modern player character design. You know, I play a lot of Free Liga games where relationships are kind of specced out at the beginning, or if you've played a bit of Traveller character generation in the modern Mongoose editions, there's these elements where you have these hooks between the player characters, and this was a really detailed hooks. I mean, it's quite a bold step to start the adventure. These are not new villagers going off on their first adventure. They've gone on some epic quests together, then they've separated for 5 years and are meeting up as established heroes. So they've got a very rich backstory, perhaps too rich, some might say. I think one of the things I found quite challenging when I came to run this in 2020 was those characters are so well known. It's a heavy weight to lift to play Raistlin or Caraman or any of those big names. And so actually I decided that I wouldn't. The 3.5 revision that Weiss and Hickman kind of released back in the early 2000s, it lets you play archetypes that they fulfill within the story roles. And so you can have someone who fills the role of the prophet without having to play that character exactly as it is. Because when we did it back in the 90s, I remember it being very much, you're playing Raistlin, you're trying to fit that into it, and you felt very restricted by the character based on the novelization. Obviously, we got to it. I'm not quite old enough to have got to the modules when they came out originally. So we'd read the books and we wanted to play the modules. So I feel like the pre-gens have some really interesting backstory elements that makes them very rich, but also looking at it from a 2020 perspective, it's very hard to pick those pre-gens up and run with them with any kind of sense of player freedom to do that.
Yeah, I actually completely agree with that. And like you talk about it being a sort of 2020 viewpoint, but it's really even a 1985 viewpoint. Like you can go all the way back, and it's really kind of a legacy of sort of the background of these modules. Because so the modules, the Dragonlance saga really starts like in Tracy Hickman's car. So Tracy Hickman had been hired by TSR in 1982. And in late 1982 or early 1983, he was driving in his car from Utah with his wife, Laura, and Tracy and Laura are sort of brainstorming all the cool things they want to do at TSR when they get there. And they have this idea that it would be really cool to do this sort of epic adventure with I think like at the time, I think there was 12 different types of dragons in D&D, and they thought it'd be cool to do each module in this epic adventure focusing on one of the dragons. And then shortly after they arrived at TSR, the marketing department at TSR was looking at customer survey data, and they were getting a very loud and clear message from customers saying, "Hey, you publish a lot of dungeons, but where are all the dragons?" And so the order came down. Hey, what we're looking for is projects involving dragons. We really want to emphasize dragons for a while, the other half of the name of our game, right? And so there was basically, they said, people give us proposals. And from what I've read, there were two major proposals that came through. And one was by Tracy Hickman, and the other one was by Douglas Niles. And Tracy Hickman's proposal was selected. It went by the codename Project Overlord at TSR, and eventually, of course, became Dragonlance as we know it. But it wasn't, of course, just Tracy Hickman. There was a whole team, including Douglas Niles was on the team as well, and Jeff Grubb, and just a whole bunch of other fantastic designers on the team as well. Plus, of course, an all-star roster of artists. But what's interesting, of course, is it starts as a module series. It starts as that desire. And it's only later that somebody says, wouldn't it be interesting if we did this novelization? Which these days would be like, looking back on it now, it's almost impossible to imagine Dragonlance without the novels. But there's nothing obvious in 1983 about saying, hey, shouldn't we write like a trilogy of books and publish it about this adventure module that we're doing? But of course, it changes everything, right? But that's an interesting legacy because there's an alternate reality where the Dragonlance saga happens and is developed and is published, and the books, the novels, the things that we think of as like these towering edifices of Dragonlance, the chronicles and the legends and so forth, that those don't actually happen. And so it's an interesting thought experiment to kind of think about what the pre-gens would look like and what the legacy of those pre-gens would look like and how those pre-gens would play at the table if the novels hadn't existed, if not only if we at the table didn't have the novels and now the animated movie and all the other ways that we can access those characters to sort of measure up against, but if and actually in the writing of the modules those novels hadn't existed, because so they're developing and making the modules, and then at the same time Tracy Hickman starts writing the novels based on the modules they're designing, but they haven't finished designing the modules yet. So there's like a chicken and egg thing that goes back and forth between the two of them. And as you read through the whole Dragonlance saga, increasingly as the series goes on, you run into more and more places where they're just like, we're not sure how to do this and how to make these character dramas happen. So just do it like the books, do it like it happens in the novels. And that becomes more and more of a straitjacket as the series goes on as well. So I guess to bring that all back around, I think 100%. I think if you want to get back to sort of what the original experience of the Dragonlance saga would have been in the absence of the novels existing, you really want to break away from the existing Infellows as characters and forge your own way of thinking about your own characters and your own relationship with the saga, and sort of forge your own saga with those characters. I think that's 100% the best way, and it's definitely how I would go about running the campaign today.
Yeah, and it can work really well. Particularly some of the later modules get rightful criticism that they are very railroady. You're in a straitjacket. I think there's one particular module where I was running it, and they're going to get captured. They're in a prison caravan, a slave caravan, and all these things are going to happen. And they're kind of witnesses to the events, and there's long read aloud texts, etc. But this module does feel very liberatingly free, and kind of tying this back to what you said about Zach Soroff. The dungeon itself is wonderful design. It's got many different pathways through, lots of unique little encounters that can go either way depending on how the party reacts. Obviously, the novels kind of maybe preload certain things, and the pre-gens do as well. I think if you're playing Flint the Dwarf, your attitude to the Gully Dwarfs is going to be one way. I think we had a dwarf character who played by a player, and their attitude to the Gully Dwarfs was based on the setting, so you have a certain reaction to them. But then there's other aspects of it, and there's lots of the physical geography of the dungeon allows you to explore it in multiple ways, and there are vast areas which your player characters may not explore at all because they've chosen one particular path. They get to the climax and then it's a mad dash out. So the whole areas of this incredible thing goes awry. And actually that led to one challenge as a GM is, as you're distributing magic items, etc., the way that it's laid out, you could have your party go through the whole thing and come out with barely any of the good stuff because they just missed out on those particular nooks and crannies. Or they may strike it lucky and find some beautiful stuff along the way. But that and the wilderness phase of it between, the introduction and the dungeon is very sandboxy to me. There's lots of locations, there's lots of different and entire areas of the map may be skipped entirely, and you may never experience that in your game. And certainly from my memory of the novelization, which I read just before running it again, there was bits of it that are in the modules that just never come up in the books. They're just not there. So it feels much more free than the series as a whole gets credit for and rightfully criticized for later on. So I've kind of drifted into things that don't work. What's the bits of the adventure that didn't work for you?
Well, if you're looking at just specifically DL1, the Dragons of Despair, I think that what doesn't work in this module, because you're talking about like you're talking about the overall structure of the module. You have sort of the beginning hook of the module, which is that the PCs have all returned back from their 5-year quest to try to find some evidence of the true gods, and they have all failed. And then they run into Gold Moon and
Riverwind.
So they run into Gold Moon and Riverwind, and they have this blue crystal staff, right? And the whole goal of this adventure is to take the blue crystal staff, which is a divine artifact, a connection to the true gods, and take it to Zak Saroth for reasons which become clear when you get to Zak Saroth, which is unlocking the discs of Mishakal and sort of opening up the world to the worship of the true gods once again. So there's the 3 sections are the beginning where you get the blue crystal staff, that sort of sandboxy, what I think of as a region crawl of the area around Solace as you are dealing with both the beginning of the invasion of the Draconians into the area, and then you get to Zak Saroth, and there's the ruined city that then goes into the dungeon beneath Zak Saroth. And so, you have those sort of big chunks, and all of those big chunks on kind of a fundamental level work really well and mix together to make a really satisfying adventure. Where I find Dragons of Despair struggles is often in the little details. So, and a lot of places it's actually is that railroading that begins affecting things on a macro scale later in the series that are still here on a micro scale in this section. So, like, for example, there's one section in what is this should be this very sandboxy region crawl through the area around Solace, where like there's a river, and the question is, well, how do the PCs get across the river? And it's reading through the text, they're like, nothing works unless they build a raft and go rafting down the river. They can't raft across the river. They can't swim across the river. Nothing works except I have an image in my mind of rafting down the river, and so this is what we're going to do, everything in our power to force the PCs to do. And the weird part is that there's actually no reason for that other than that Tracy Hickman, the designer, had this image of rafting down the river. And so, like, everything is thrown in the way of doing anything other than that. But there's no reason for it. It's a very weird thing. And so those are the kinds of small things. The good news is that any dungeon master with a little bit of experience can very easily ignore that kind of low-level, weird railroading and just, play to find out and work over that, which is I think why this adventure can work very easily and very well at a table.
Agreed. Some of the NPC interactions as well are what I'd like to term keyword unlocked. You have to say the right kind of phrases, be in the right place at the right sequence of times, which I think if you are looking to run this, you'd be well advised just to ignore that and make it work for your group and allow the players to invent and tackle it in new and innovative ways. One thing that I found particularly not irritating, but I thought it was a bit of a lazy design thing, is the blue crystal staff, the MacGuffin that starts the adventure and ends the adventure.
Well, I mean, if we go back to the idea of who are these characters that you are playing, the blue crystal staff has deep meaning to Gold Moon and Riverwind because of their backstory with it. I think that players will generally have a little bit of difficulty connecting to that backstory, and without that backstory, so like without the backstory of Gold Moon's father refusing to let Riverwind and Gold Moon marry, and so Riverwind has to go out and find an artifact of the true gods, and then he does, but the father rejects it, and so then they're in flight from that. All that's an interesting kind of character-based connection to that artifact. But it's all in the background. It's nothing that the players will be connected to. But if we go back to our earlier discussion of like how would you launch this adventure and have the players play their own characters, I think there's a lot of things you can do in that process to really kind of make sure that the blue crystal staff is something that the players can create a meaningful connection to. And the other aspect of that as well is that the other thing that's missing from that is that the motivation to take the blue crystal staff to Zaxxaroth and why you are doing that is not well established in the module at all. What you have is you have a couple or three different NPCs who, if you interact with them, will be like, wait, I'm getting a vision of you taking the blue crystal staff to Zaxxaroth. And I'm not even like summarizing. It's really just like what they say. It's like there's a unicorn who's like, it's amazing. There was this spirit who is, the dungeon master who showed up yesterday and told me you need to like take the blue crystal staff to Zaxxaroth. There's a storyteller in a bar who's like, I just had a vision. You have to take the blue crystal staff to Zaxxaroth. And that's not great because it doesn't give the players any sense of why this is important, why they want to do this. They're not. It is a pure MacGuffin. In the sense that they just have to go through the rote procedure of take item A to point X and drop it off and unlock your ending. Take your plot coupon and redeem it for your ending. So it really does for me come back to like how you'd approach that opening of the campaign. And my approach, like, so one thing I do when I am working with players to create characters for a long-term campaign like this is that I will ask the players I'll give the players like the basic pitch of what the campaign is, and then I'll ask them to basically pitch their character concepts back to me. And sometimes when I get that pitch back from them, I will get, a couple of sentences, or I might get a couple of paragraphs, or if a player's, some players will be like, here's like 5 pages of backstory, and all of it's fantastic. And then what I do is, as the game master, is I try and look at those character concepts and whatever they have, and I try to find ways to link and develop those character backgrounds given what I know about the campaign world. So, for example, if a player was like, I really want to play like a knight in your campaign, and I'd be like, well, I know Dragonlance, so I know that there's the Solamnic Orders of Knights. Here's a bunch of information about that. Would you be interested in these knights or these other orders of knights? Which order of knights would you be interested in your background? Where did your knight come from? Here's some options for that. And we kind of develop back and forth with that material. And so the one thing I would do looking at launching a Dragonlance campaign, or even just looking at this adventure, which you could absolutely run as a one-shot in this sense, would be I really be looking at like, okay, well, the concept is that you guys 5 years ago, all of your PCs went out to find evidence of the true gods, right? And I would let the players tell me, I would say, make sure to tell me, why did your character want to find evidence of the true gods? Like, make sure that they are thinking about why they care about this. both as players and as characters. And then we develop that as an idea. And then the details I would look at with that, if it beyond a one shot of DL1 Dragons of Despair, is, I know, like you were talking about the third edition version of the modules, where they still had like the big archetypes of the NPCs and like creating your own versions of those archetypes. I wouldn't worry so much about the archetypal as I would just think about it in terms of the function of those long-term connections, the equivalent of Aragorn being the heir of Gondor and the sword that's broken and all of those things. The equivalent of that is that as you go through the Dragonlance saga, the PCs have these pre-existing connections to the locations and the NPCs that they meet along the way. And so if I was in this process of back and forth developing characters with my players, I'm really going to be looking at like, how am I going to, knowing where the saga goes, what the overall scope of the saga is, I'd be looking at like, okay, well, where are the major NPCs in this campaign that these character concepts that the players are bringing to me could have these pre-existing relationships with. So as we explore the campaign world, it wouldn't be that like they necessarily need to have a relationship with Laurana. Just because Tanis had a relationship with Laurana, maybe they do. Maybe it's a completely different relationship. Maybe they're Laurana's sister instead of being their ex-lover or whatever the case may be. So like you have that's the kind of thing. But then specifically in terms of this blue crystal staff MacGuffin, what I would do is I would tell them all when they were pitching their concepts, I would say, so you've all been gone for 5 years, you're looking for the true gods, and the pitch is you guys all come back to Solace at the beginning of the campaign. That's the opening scene that we're aiming for. And none of you have found anything. And then I would take one of the players aside and I'd be like, you actually found a thing. It's this blue crystal staff. And so they would get this cool moment at the beginning of the first session where they're like, actually, guys, look what I found. And then the other thing I would do too is either that player's PC or a different PC would have found some lore about the significance of this blue crystal staff and Zaxxaroth, and that at the beginning of the adventure, that information cluster would already have established both the personal connection to the staff, to the quest, but also more specifically, why does the blue crystal staff need to be taken to Zaxxaroth? And that's something that like the DM I think would have to develop a little bit, because it's not entirely clear why the blue crystal staff needs to go to Zaxxaroth. And there needs to be something about, the lore of why the true gods withdrew themselves and what the significance of bringing that blue crystal staff to Zaxxaroth is in terms of renewing that contact with the true gods. So I guess to sum up, yes, I would do more with the blue crystal staff to make it less of a MacGuffin and more specific and real lore to it.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I think, definitely the way that you describe working with players to establish those characters and that background and the motivation rings very true to the way that I approached it. The blue crystal staff has three things I think that make it particularly irksome to me. One is the fact that Goldmoon has it on her person, and she got it from Zaxxaroth several days before the adventure starts, and she has the player has no knowledge about going to Zaxxaroth, the statue, or anything else. So there's a little bit of a memory wipe that has to happen for that player character to make sense of why they don't just know, oh yeah, I go there and I put it on the statue. And the other thing is that the staff itself isn't the thing, isn't the objective. So it's just the means to the objective. The discs of Mishakal are the objective. So that's what you really need, and which makes you wonder, why didn't they just give her the discs of Mishakal to begin with? Obviously, it'd be a very short adventure. But then the third thing that really, really bothered me is that basically the power of the staff is it's the only healing thing available in the world at this point. And there's a big problem with modern 5th edition D&D running this, is that you have to convince a player to play a cleric to fulfill that prophet role, which in the 3rd edition is these roles. And the prophet role is the only one that really matters. All the others, I think you're right. I think I wouldn't worry about the archetypes. They're nice to kind of feel Dragonlance-y, but they don't really make much of a material difference to how the adventure runs. But the prophet role is absolutely essential, because without the prophet, you can't use the discs. But the prophet is a cleric, and basically the cleric has no powers. For the entirety of this adventure, they can at best swing a quarterstaff or a club. But they do have this cool artifact which does some healing. The big MacGuffin role that it plays right at the end, besides unlocking the final conclusion, is it kills the dragon. Because even a party of 5th level adventurers has little chance against an adult black dragon. And the only way to defeat the dragon is with the staff. And you can, build tensions, run the combat very well to make it feel like they have a lot of agency. But basically, it's the entire last scene depends on the DM dropping the hint, use the staff. There's like a little blurb that you read out to them, and they have a vision. It's visions, a lot of visions in this adventure. And that, to me, kind of robs the climactic feel of that cinematic moment from the player's agency. And also, it completely confused my players who were new to D&D. I had a few players who were playing D&D for very much first or second time, not very many times. And they got to that and they defeated the dragons. The next dragon they met, they were very gung-ho about it, but they didn't have an artifact that just kills dragons. So right. it was a terrible lesson to teach players about fighting dragons. So the Blue Crystal Staff has bothered me a lot in this adventure.
Well, and I think, kind of work backwards through some of that. Like the memory wipe is actually a significant problem in the adventure, not only in terms of, like you say, the backstory of the Blue Crystal Staff, where Riverwind gets it from Zaxxaroth, brings it to the Kushu, brings it to Goldmoon, and then they're like, "Where's Zaxxaroth?" And it's like, don't you know Riverwind? Like, I don't understand how you don't remember that thing. But it's actually something that kind of afflicts the whole campaign, because you have this backstory of the Innfellows having left Solace and all traveled the world in different directions for 5 years. Now, during the last 2 to 3 years, you'll later discover in the saga, there's been this giant draconian army that has been waging a world war everywhere. But none of the Innfellows in their 5 years of travels have any idea that this is happening. And so the whole premise of the saga is that these Innfellows left for 5 years, explored the far reaches of the world, and came back empty-handed. But none of the Innfellows have any actual knowledge of the wider game world and what's going on in it, because the designers want to have these big surprises like, hey, there's a draconian army, surprise. And so that becomes kind of that's a very weird thing at the beginning of the adventure. And so dealing with what do you actually know as a result, what do you know about the world as a result of your 5-year mission is I think would be something really crucial in terms of that. And I kind of brushed over this, but yeah, I think the other thing too is in my mind, fixing the Blue Crystal Staff means that you did not find it in Zaxxaroth, that you found it someplace else, and that you are bringing it back to Zaxxaroth, probably with some kind of religious imagery around the idea of fulfilling or keeping a promise to the true gods that was broken during the Cataclysm 300 years ago. That needs more development in my mind, but you really want to again have that specificity of why we're doing that. And one of the things that you can perhaps show as part of that lore is to begin dropping clues to the idea that the staff could be used to defeat the dragon, who for whatever reason is in Zaxxaroth, which is another point of continuity in the adventure, which is a little bit fuzzy. Is you have Onyx, the black dragon, who is in Zaxxaroth, and some sections of the adventure suggest that she just showed up, and other sections of the adventure suggest that she's actually been lairing there for centuries, possibly specifically to guard and prevent the Blue Crystal Staff from being returned. Although again, you also have the thing that was there to begin with. So it's a very weird continuity. So all that continuity definitely needs to be cleaned up in order for the adventure to work, and in order for the players not to feel like they're just being arbitrarily herded through a series of plot points.
You've been kind of doing it as we've talked, but I'd be interested to know how you might approach making this adventure your own. If you were to, bring it to the table today with, it's 2022, a couple of years since I last brought it to the table. But yeah, how would you approach it in terms of modern players with modern D&D and presenting it as this classic, given the weight of its history and assuming that some of your players will know Dragonlance pretty well. There'll be fans wanting to relive it. And some, as I've probably experienced, maybe you might not know anything about the novels, just have heard of it as some novelization of D&D that happened in the 80s and that it's gone past them.
Well, it's interesting because actually I've been I've recently on my Twitter been doing a let's read of the whole saga, which of course how we found each other for this really great discussion. But as part of that, I've been kind of diving into the original saga, the 15-year anniversary edition, which changed a bunch of stuff, the third edition versions of the modules as well. And so I've been talking to like my friends and players about the adventures as well. What's interesting is that there are definitely like Dragonlance fans out there, but there's a large body of new D&D players who really have no knowledge about Dragonlance. And that'll probably change quite a bit in about 4 months when the new Dragonlance stuff starts dropping from Wizards of the Coast. But like right now, there's a significant amount of people who would actually be able to come to this adventure kind of fresh in a way that hasn't been true for most of my fandom. And then there's a lot of people who read the books 20 years ago, like I did, and like their memories of the books are like, yeah, those were good. I enjoyed those, but it's real dim now. And maybe if those players got re-involved with the adventure, they'd start seeing things that they would recognize. But I think the biggest thing in terms of of approaching this is to really make sure that as you would be reinventing this module, which takes less work than the rest of the series to some extent, but reinventing this series as a whole is really looking past, like we were just talking about these arbitrary plot points, looking past that to the actual cool world building and situation building, which is present throughout the entire saga, and really focusing on that and empowering the players to chart their own course through it. In which case, very quickly, the legacy of what happened in the books will break and fade away. The more that the players are able to chart their own course and forge their own destiny and make their own saga, the more interesting I think it becomes for them, and the more you get away from that. In terms of in terms of the specific adventure, the structure that really stands out to me actually would also include a little bit of the beginning of the next adventure, the DL2 adventure. And what I mean by that is, so in this adventure, you have the PCs, they return to Solace, they end up with the Blue Crystal Staff, they knew they need to journey across the local region to Zaxxaroth eventually. They eventually find Zaxxaroth, go down in the dungeon, get the Disc of Mishakal. And then as they come back out of the dungeon at the beginning of the next adventure, they cross back into the lands around Solace, and they discover that the Draconian army that they had heard hints of in the first adventure in Dragons of Despair, that dragon army has swept across the land and conquered it in their absence. And so in the second module, that sequence is heavily railroaded. It's one of the most heavily railroaded sequences in the entire saga, because what the authors are trying to drive towards is they really want the PCs to be captured by the Draconians and put into a slave train that can be taken down to Pax Tharkus. They can then be rescued by elves, and a whole sequence of specific plot points can happen to the PCs. And what I really want to focus on is, in terms of making this adventure my own, is I really want to focus on exploring the area around Solace at the beginning, and then having the exact same region crawl after Zaxxaroth, after the dungeon, but completely rekeyed with the post-invasion state. And by getting rid of the railroaded elements of that and really letting the players fully explore at the beginning of Dragons of Despair, and then fully explore again at the beginning of the second adventure, that in the same place but a completely transformed version of it, you'd really let the players discover for themselves this sharp contrast of what the Draconians have done. And I think that, to me, then turns Zaxxaroth as a dungeon, this amazing dungeon, into this really strong pivot point around that. And that actually, to me, feels it's a tale as old as time. It's the 1980s module, but you can make that 100% fresh at a new table because it's happening at the table right now. And in terms of Dragons of Despair, like you say, most of the pieces of that region crawl I think there's 40 or so different regions in the area that are all keyed with varying degrees of content. Like in terms of Dragons of Despair, that's really all there. The only thing that really needs to happen is that there needs to be a motivation for the PCs not to just go straight to Zaxxaroth because they know where it is. And so I would really look at like trying to figure out how they, one part of the Blue Crystal Staff didn't come from there. So one of the PCs doesn't know just to walk back there, but that they are looking for it. And so they have to explore this region crawl to find clues to where Zaxxaroth is in the lands of despair beyond the mountains. So that's the first thing I would do. And then on the flip side, like I say, I would get rid of the railroad at the beginning of the second adventure and rekey the region map with the devastation brought by the Draconian armies. And the big sort of revelation that you'd have clues throughout there would be that they are taking prisoners, and maybe the PCs do end up getting captured if that's the way the game goes, but they don't need to be in order to be driven to the idea that we should go rescue these characters that are being taken captive. We need to go do a prison break, and you can get the same result without railroading the PCs. So that's, I guess, on a big level, that's my answer to like how I would make the adventure my own, is really looking at that pivot of invasion around the big cool dungeon of Zaxxaroth.
I really like that. I think I particularly like the idea of having the regional exploration have a before conquest by the dragon armies and after conquest, but actually tapering it a little bit, because there is within DL2, I think, enough information about the different stages of where the armies are on that map, on the narrow focus map of these particular modules. And so you can see, okay, before and after of each of these keyed areas, how that would work out. And I think there's more you could do, with the idea of the characters have been out in the world for 5 years. Armies, even Draconian armies, and I want to come back to the Draconians in a minute, but even the Draconian armies don't spring out of nothing. There's all this going on in Solamnia. There's the goblins, the hobgoblins are involved in some degree. There's a lot of moving pieces, and I think the characters would have some of that sense that the world is on a precipice, and the true gods may be their answer to it. If only we had the true gods, war could be averted. And they may not even know the full scale and who's behind it yet, but they would have a sense of that. And that could add some urgency to the mission of finding, what the staff is all about. I think the DL1 and DL2 would make a much better combination. And if you get rid of those rails at the beginning of DL2, it would work pretty well. One of the hardest things as a GM, I think, with D&D characters to run is having the players captured in a satisfying way so that they can escape. And there is a moment within DL1 in the swamps where that can happen. And if it does happen, they get to experience the fake dragon and the bonfire. And it's really kind of a cool set scene, but it's murder to get player characters captured, because they'd rather die than get captured.
No. And it's like my experience, like you say, is that any point where a published adventure is like, and then the PCs get captured, I'm like, you didn't playtest this adventure with actual players in the real world, because I've never encountered players who are like, yeah, and then we surrender. Like it never happens. Like maybe one time in 50 do you actually have that be the way that it plays out at the table. And anytime you're trying to force it in particular, like the players are going to resist that hard every single time. There are cases where, like, if it plays out naturally that way, that's great. But anytime I see something like that in an adventure, whether it's DL1 or DL2, like the fact they do it back to back in this campaign is hard. I'm just like, just that's not the way that's going to play out. We're going to figure out some other way to bring the fake dragon on stage. So we're going to figure out some other way to get them pointed towards Pax Tharkus and the elves in DL2. You just have to not have that be a predetermined outcome.
If I was redoing this to reconsider, is this prophet role character, there's a little bit of a main actor syndrome with it, particularly because the adventure doesn't start without their involvement. If they're captured or killed, basically the story ends. There's very little. We can kind of do the stuff, but there's not much point to it. So they can't die. And then at the end, they have to do the killing blow of the dragon. So I wonder what your thoughts are maybe on how we might get rid of that dependency, and because it's also a really unsatisfying character role to play. Although you are the main character, you are not a good D&D character because you have no powers. You have nothing you can do in the modern game, especially where everything is divine powers for a cleric.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, if you look back at the game that the modules were designed for, low-level clerics actually weren't that different from fighters, but they had, like, if you look all the way back to like 1974 D&D, first level clerics didn't have spells at all. So like starting it without spells was not necessarily a terrible thing, even though I know Dragonlance, the slightly higher level characters, but they were still fully functional characters just without their spells. And that's certainly not true. Like if you played a cleric in 5th edition, particularly a 5th level cleric in 5th edition, without any access to their magical divine abilities, they would be a terrible character to play. And so my first gut impulse, and I'd have to give some thought to how this would actually play out, is that, like you say, in the adventures published, Gold Moon is this predetermined prophet character. She is the one with the staff, so somehow she is the one with the unique connection to the gods. But I think what you really want to play with is that the important thing is actually the staff, and that any one of the PCs could be the one to return the staff. And in some ways, it's all the PCs who do that. And then the interesting mechanic for me is the idea is actually the discs of Mishakal, and that the idea is that the discs of Mishakal are this divine conduit to the teachings of the true gods that allows true clerics to reemerge into the world. And that one of the things that happens over the course of the saga is that the discs of Mishakal begin getting spread around, that the PCs share them with various NPCs, and that those NPCs then become clerics. And this is something where in the saga, this really cool bit of massive player PC empowerment, where they're the ones who get to spread the gospel and choose who are going to be the new conduits of the true gods. Because the saga is trying to hit these predetermined points, the PCs don't get to do that. The saga predetermines that there's this specific NPC in the second or third adventure that will be the one who reads the discs, and then from that point forward, he's the one who is like in charge of the new religion. So that's one thing I would definitely change, is that like the cool thing here is that you all get to start a new religion together, and that's cool. And then in terms of that sort of like cleric archetype, I would certainly open that up to the PCs and say, hey, now that you've returned the blue crystal staff, you have this moment of communion with the true gods. Any one of you can at this point choose to become to whatever your character was. You can now become a cleric of equal level. Like you are transformed through this experience of communion. And then that really is like not one specific PC needs to do that. That PC, if there is a PC who chooses to do that, they aren't crippled as a character beforehand because they were playing a fully fledged character. And then so you have this blue crystal staff that provides the healing that is expected in D&D, despite the fact that no one has any access to divine healing before this moment in terms of innate abilities. And then after the end of this adventure, the PCs, one or more of the PCs, can choose to become a cleric and transform their character in a moment of divine inspiration. And then after that, you still have the discs of Mishakal and the ability for the players to be in that position of empowerment to share the knowledge and to spread these powers into the general populace. And how they choose to do that and why they choose to do that and who they choose to share it with all become really interesting questions, and that the answers will discover together as the campaign plays out.
I really like that. I think in terms of the stakes of this adventure are pretty massive. The stakes of the campaign, I think one of the things that I enjoyed as a kid reading the Dragons novels and playing Dragonlance was epic fantasy in a way that most of your D&D games weren't epic really at the same scale. And it has lots of cool things. Obviously there's the dragon orbs, the lances themselves, all that kind of little set pieces. And even in the very railroady modules that follow, there are wonderful bits of exploration and interactions you can have. One thing this module actually has too much of is content in that regional exploration bit, because the balance here is between having that sense of urgency of going to Zaxaroth. You've got this thing that's being chased and hunted for, and you know that this is the payoff, but also having the opportunity to really explore. And I think one thing I wish I'd done more of when I ran this more recently is to give, if the players needed, and it would solve a future problem with the railroading, which is to give the players more motivation to care about the different areas. So getting involved in the politics of the Seeker lands, meeting the elves, which you can do in this module if you go down that direction, and having more ties with the Plainsfolk, or caring about their destruction under the dragon armies, is going to be really pivotal to having the agency at hand that the players may choose to go to Pax Tharkus later and rescue everyone there. Because I think ultimately that sequence of actions in DL2, which is to get them to meet the elves, have a reason to go to Pax Tharkus and organize the slave rebellion and give the elves time to escape, all of that can be done if the player agency, if they have enough motivation to do it, if they have,
if they care about the people who are being taken, exactly, that you don't have to force them to do it. Exactly. Yeah. And I think you're 100% right. And so I've kind of glided over this a couple times, but I think that is why that at the beginning of the campaign, it would be, they know they have to take the staff to Zaxaroth, but they, to Zaxaroth, but they don't know where Zaxaroth is. They know from the lore that it's somewhere near Solus, actually. And so they know they need to find it somewhere around here. But then, so the motivation at the beginning of the campaign is that they begin exploring the local area, maybe talking to the Kushu, because maybe lore about Zaxaroth, like whatever lore they have about Zaxaroth that they found with the Blue Crystal Staff or somewhere else in their searches, like that lore says, hey, actually, it also appears in the legends of the Kushu tribe, and so that would give you a motivation to travel to the Kushu tribe and speak to them about their legendary and so forth. So having just a few clues that point to various things in the sandbox where you could go to find more information about Zaxaroth would motivate the PCs to explore the region initially, and then once they figure out where Zaxaroth is, then they can turn and begin exploring towards Zaxaroth. That would be how I would motivate that initial sandbox portion, and that's how you get away from that the motivation can be, we have to get to Zaxaroth, but the way we get to Zaxaroth is by exploring the region and beginning to form these political connections as well.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me as well. I guess my final question for you, Justin, is this a module that is worth running today? Would you bring it to the table? Would you give it your own particular remixology on the adventure?
It's tricky because there's some really amazing stuff in the Dragonlance saga, and I have a kind of semi-clear picture in my mind of what you would need to do to turn it into something really amazing and to kind of break some of the railroading stuff. And I guess I'll talk about that at two levels. So the first level is this adventure. And there actually, as I mentioned this briefly earlier, but I think there actually is a strong possibility of kind of running this adventure as a one-shot. And what you'd probably do for that is really kind of de-emphasize the Draconian invasion, because if you're running it as a one-shot, that's not going to go anywhere. So you've got maybe Draconian agents who are local, and you'd run it kind of like a World War II drama set in New York, where you'd have Axis agents like the Draconians active in the local area, but the war is happening someplace else. And what you're doing is very important for the war effort. You have to forge this new connection with the true gods, et cetera, that will affect the outcome of the war. But in terms of the one-shot structure, you set the stakes, but the big conclusion is you have forged a new connection with the true gods. This epic stakes are, like you said, epic stakes in this adventure, and those epic stakes can absolutely provide a really satisfying conclusion to a one-shot adventure. And I say one-shot, but it probably plays out over 3 to 4 sessions, right? And at the end of it, you all have this divine communion. You've reopened the worlds to the true gods. Huge success, good work. The question is, if you want to take the next step and proceed into the wider saga, there's a lot. It's like, what I should say is that that running this as a one-shot, super easy, barely an inconvenience. But if you take the next step and begin looking at how can I run the whole saga, things get more complicated really quickly. But one of the reasons why, as you probably know, on my site, the Alexandrian, I've done remixes of a number of adventures. Dragon Heist, Descent into Avernus, the Eternal Lies campaign for Trail of Cthulhu. And those remixes take different forms in terms of like adding new material, changing things, fixing things I perceive as problems, adding more lore, adding new adventures, that kind of thing. And so if I was looking at like doing a remix like that on my site for Dragonlance, I would begin running into some of the same problems that the original creators of Dragonlance did, which is that you are dealing with epic fantasy. And there is a tension between what is cool about epic fantasy, which is that your PCs have the ability to make choices that will affect the course of the world, and that when I'm publishing a series of modules, I need to force you to walk through those modules and therefore not give you the ability to make choices that will affect the course of the world, but instead to force you to make the choices I want you to make. And so there is that tension between those things. And so if I was doing this as a remix on my site, I would begin running into some of those same problems, which is that I don't know what every single individual DM's group might do, and providing the tools to deal with that huge scope of possible outcomes can be very difficult, even with modern techniques that are a little bit less reliant on railroading, frankly, to solve those problems. But as an individual dungeon master, picking up this material and looking at what I would need to do to run it just for my own group, it becomes a more manageable or tractable problem. And the reason for that is I don't have to worry about every single possible thing that they might do. I only need to prep for what they've actually done so far. And when you look at the Dragonlance saga in that light and really just break the bonds of the preconceptions of this is the path that you have to follow through this material, then there's something about the Dragonlance saga which is tantalizing. And it's tantalizing because the scope of the project is so large that once you begin ignoring the specific path of this happens and then this happens and then you need to force the PCs to go here because this needs to happen. Once you kind of break away from that, the various modules of the saga detail all the different fronts of the war. That you have the siege of the Clarist's Tower, you have all the things that are happening over in the Elven Forest, you have the islands around the Maelstrom, you have sort of 2 or 3 different modules that are detailing what's happening in the heart of the Draconian kingdoms. And what's interesting about that is that once you break away from the idea that the adventure needs to be a specific sequence of things that play out in a specific sequence because we're publishing these modules in order, you can really, with your specific group, empower them to chart their own course about where they think they should go next to try and deal with the emerging crisis. And that's, like I said, that's a lot easier. And you can use a lot of the material from the modules in terms of what's going on in an area when the PCs get there to play and find out, to respond organically to what the players are doing, and to bring the saga to life for them. So on an individual level, I think, if you can look past the railroaded structure and just look at the situation of the world and play that situation in response to the PCs, there isn't actually a much easier course. And like we talked about a little bit about the beginning of the adventure of the saga here in Dragons of Despair, that axis around Zaxxaroth where the Draconians are out there. You establish that as a threat. The Draconians are local with agents in Zaxxaroth, etc. But then the invasion happens around the pivot of Zaxxaroth. That invasion results in prisoners of war being taken south to Pax Tharkus. A cluster of motivations and leads can drive the PCs down to Pax Tharkus for that prison break. And then once you have the prison break, that can take you all the way to Thor Bardeen, which is the dwarven fortress in the 4th adventure. And so the opening act can be a non-railroaded funnel that naturally just takes you through the story of that invasion. And then where the campaign needs to open up and doesn't in the published modules is after Thor Bardeen, when the players leave Thor Bardeen. But again, the pieces are all there, because what happens after Thor Bardeen in the saga is that the PCs eventually learn about the existence of the dragon orbs, and they learn about the existence of the dragon lances. and then you can really motivate the rest of the campaign by giving the players that information. These dragon orbs exist, and they can be found here, here, and here. Dragonlances exist, and here's some information about where you might find out more about how to recreate those as essential weapons for the war. Give them those all at once. Give them all those clues all at once, basically, maybe in Thorbardine. And then at that point, sit back and wait for the players to tell you where they're going next, and then just use the material of the saga to sort of craft your own saga. And so I think on that level, it's still a daunting task, but a very manageable one. And I think if you pulled it off, the players would feel incredibly empowered because it would be capturing that epic sense of making the choices that shape the future of the world.
That's brilliant. I like that. Some of those problems, particularly, is in the city of Tarsus, where they are split, and the port city that's nowhere near a sea, and no one knows about it, even though it happened hundreds of years ago. At that point, and I think there's even a few modules which are basically just campaign source books that give you plenty of information to piece together a trilogy or an adventure campaign of your own, which doesn't need to follow any of the modules and may not even touch on huge swaths of the campaign. But it's interesting to me that there is such interesting plot points inserted into even the very early modules that are so pivotal in later modules. So there is this smithy from Solace, loses his arm in one of the railroaded encounters in the slave train in the next one. And he needs to lose his arm because he's going to have the silver arm of Ergoth that's going to be able to make these Dragonlances and stuff like that. I think there's lots of little tweaks in that. You have to kind of take a very holistic look at the modules and go, okay, if I restore player agency here and this cutscene doesn't really happen for them, it's still got to happen in a way that makes sense, or I've got to just scrap that and at least be mindful of it. So it is a very challenging campaign to run with off rails and restoring that player agency, because there's so much that clearly they thought, oh, we did this, we forced them to witness this, and therefore we're going to use it later on. But overall, it's I think the one-shot idea is a good one. To me, the DL1 was the most satisfying of the Dragons of Autumn collection that I played through. By that point, I think I was I had sated the need for Dragonlance adventures, and I was very disappointed with the ridiculousness of some of the later modules. They get a bit problematic, I think, in some places. But anyway, Justin, I'd like to thank you for your time today. Is there anything you'd like to shout out, any projects you or Atlas Games are doing that you'd like to let the listeners know about?
I suppose as a good marketing person, I should absolutely do that. People should come and check out my website, The Alexandrian, which is at thealexandrian.net. As I mentioned earlier, we do remixes there. There's a lot of GMing advice and the like there, as well as reviews of books like Dragonlance and so forth as well. Over at Atlas, we are actually just in the process of releasing Plaingia, which is our 5th edition Stone Age fantasy campaign setting, designed by David Somerville. He took a really fantastic approach to designing a Stone Age fantasy campaign, which is, rather than thinking about all the things that a Stone Age campaign doesn't, he said, everything you can do in a 5th edition campaign, you can do in Planescape. But also, here's all the cool things that being in the Stone Age lets you do, or like the fantasy Stone Age lets you do, like riding a Triceratops and the like. So check out Plaingia too. I think people will really enjoy sort of if you enjoy the epic of Dragonlance, I think you'll enjoy the epic scope of Plaingia as well.
I am definitely looking forward to that.
And finally,
Dragons of Despair is perhaps the standout adventure of the DL series, and is worth playing or borrowing liberally from. It contains such a mix of novel ideas for a D&D adventure. The sandbox elements make for a rich campaign setting, and the stakes are suitably high. It truly is epic. Zaxxaroth is a wonderful dungeon worth exploring. With a little tweaking, it could run alongside the sequel, Dragons of Flame, to make for a much more expansive Dragonlance campaign than was originally published by TSR. For all its faults, such as the heavy railroading, particularly in later modules, Dragonlance was the most ambitious cross-media fantasy setting and adventure series that originated in role-playing games in my lifetime. it is hard not to look at the heroes and have a wistful fondness for them and their epic struggle against the forces of darkness. Thank you for listening to Run the Adventure with me, your host, Sid Razavi, and a special thanks to Justin for his time on this episode. If you have any feedback, questions, or thoughts on this episode, you can reach me on email gm@runtheadventure, all one word, .com, or find me on Twitter at RTA_podcast. You'll find links in the show notes as well to both of these. If you'd like to support the show, please do consider posting a review wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help more listeners find the show. If you'd like to help with the costs of the show financially, there is a Patreon to do just that. I'm happy to say that Patreons get a 10% discount with Dragonlance, a tabletop role-playing game specialist store. You can find a link to the Patreon and to Dragonlance in the show notes. Now, until the next episode, may your adventures run fantastic.